government wants buildings that are more, quote, sustainable, economic, green, and pleasing to the eye. And this follows President Xi Jinping's criticism of weird architecture in 2014 when he called for less ostentatious buildings. Joining us now to discuss China's skyline is Anthony Wood, live from Chicago. He's the executive director of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. That's the organization behind the skyscraper study we just cited. Anthony, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, Anthony, let's start off with this move to streamline the skyline. China does have some of the world's most unique architecture. Call it weird, call it wacky, call it unconventional. Whatever you want to call it, the government wants less of it and has issued a directive to move away from odd-shaped buildings and towards more economic and green structures. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you know, I think there's always two sides to the argument. I think if we look back in history, you'll find that modern architecture is never a populist architecture. You know, people like what has come before. But I think the Chinese premier has a good point here. You know, I think a lot of the buildings are weird shapes, and really China should be looking for an indigenous response for its architecture, which heralds back to, in some places, thousands of years of vernacular tradition.
Well, Anthony, practically every city in the world has urban planning guidelines, restrictions, and building codes. Some are saying this is too restrictive. Is that the case, or does this promote a more responsible, less wasteful, more economic construction culture? Or do you think it unnecessarily stifles creativity?
No, I don't think it stifles creativity at all. In actual fact, I think, you know, a lot of modern architecture, and you could say high-rise buildings are one of the worst culprits, are homogenizing cities in the same way that Starbucks has homogenized the coffee drinking experience. And actually, every country should be looking for its own responses to architecture and high-rise buildings that relate to the place where they're set. So actually, in these restrictions and in these guidelines, I believe are a way forward for more indigenous Chinese architecture, or indeed architecture that relates to whichever city it is around the world.
All right, well, you mentioned high-rise buildings, and as you know, it's your study. In 2015, China built the world's greatest number of skyscrapers. It's the 8th year in a row that China has built the most towers that are more than 200 meters high. Anthony, why is that, and is it surprising given the economic slowdown?
It's not surprising at all, no. I mean, the first thing you need to remember is that any tall building project is an absolute minimum of 5-6 years to come to fruition, and many of them are 10, 12, maybe even 15 years. China works faster than large parts of the world. But these projects that we're seeing completed last year would have been conceived, the original ideas for them, 6-7 years ago. So the economic slowdown in China now is relatively recent, in the last year, 18 months. So it's no surprise that China has been building the most skyscrapers year on year for the past 8 years, and actually that will continue for at least a couple more years, simply because of the sheer number of projects that are already under construction and nearing completion.
So there's a lot of residual projects that we're going to see come into fruition over the next couple of years, regardless of the slowdown. Now, Anthony, there are over 300 skyscrapers, to your point, in development right now in China. But why the big push? Why do local governments want to build skyscrapers particularly?
Well, I think there's three reasons for this. You know, one is a factor that's been driving tall buildings for over 100 years, and that is return on land investment, the financial equation. That's as true to China as it was in 1930s New York. It's always been a driver of tall buildings. The second thing that's valid is that cities see tall buildings and skylines as a way to brand themselves. In the same way that car companies perhaps did in 1930s America, and hence the Chrysler building, it's now moved to a city scale where, like, for example, you can see it in the titles of the program, Shanghai Tower. Instead of it being about a corporation, it's about a city. But the third factor, which I think is the most valid factor, is the reality in China and many other countries around the world that's seeing huge population growth and urbanization. You know, United Nations statistics show that 189,000 people are urbanizing on this planet every day. Well, where do those people go? Moving from countryside to city, where do they go? And in China, the sheer number has made a need for denser cities, because the horizontal city is an unsustainable proposition into the future. So that's why we're seeing denser, more vertical cities.
Well, Anthony, as you mentioned, a big push towards urbanization. But so far, are commercial property developers seeing a return on investment? Are they finding tenants? Is this going to pay off as expected, do you think?
Well, I think the answer up to now has been yes. You know, no property developer is stupid. They would not put millions and millions of dollars into a tower if they did not have, you know, an assurity with return on investment. However, like any cycle, like any, you know, business proposition, the ones who get there first reap the rewards, and the ones who come later take a greater risk. And I think we're starting to see that in China. I think especially in the second and third tier cities. I do believe that those markets will come back. You know, I mean, in America, I mean, the sheer fact that there are 160 cities in China today with a population greater than 1 million people right now. You know, in America, that's only about 10 cities. So we need to remind ourselves, and I believe that the economics will come back, and these projects will be successful. But I think some are struggling now, whether it's residential sales or office letting in the second and third tier cities. I think some of them are struggling.
Okay. Well, good to hear from you. Thank you for your insight, Anthony Wood. We're going to have to leave it there, Executive Director of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat.